Hello everyone and happy holidays. I'm Jordan Needham. This is Jham 3D. Today we're going to be doing a tutorial based almost entirely around geometry nodes because I know that once they came out, as just experience from myself, it's like there's a lot to take in, there's a lot to learn, and we've all heard the hype of how powerful these things are, the geometry nodes, but it's almost like nerve-wracking because it's a lot to take in and you want to make sure that you actually understand them. Otherwise it kind of feels like you're falling behind or something, and I totally understand that fear. But part of this video is just to basically switch you from using particle systems and kind of start using geometry nodes instead whenever you can. And that's what I did when I was making this project right here, which I wasn't intending to be a tutorial, but I thought the final result I thought was pretty good. I was pretty happy with it, and just the fact that it's made with geometry nodes, I thought that maybe I could share it with you guys, teach you a little bit of what I've learned through using geometry nodes on this tutorial. And this is probably going to be a longer tutorial because there's a lot to go over, and I want to make sure that I actually explain things to the best of my knowledge so that you can understand them and be able to do this thing on your own without needing to follow step by step every time you watch geometry node tutorials, if you get what I'm saying. I want you to actually understand what the nodes are doing instead of just copy and pasting somebody else's work, if you get what I'm saying. So let's go ahead and save this. Save it as whatever you want, but the scene that I called the final project Serene means something like calm and undisturbed or something, and I was kind of the vibe that I was going through or going for. Now that we have our scene here and it is saved, we're gonna click A and then X and delete all of this. We're not really gonna use any of this. Now we're gonna press 1 to go into front view, Shift A, and add in a camera. This is kind of where we're going to place our camera, somewhere around here. Kind of move it back on the y-axis a little bit, but we're not too worried about the camera. I probably shouldn't have done that first, but what I like to do in every scene that I make is separate the cameras and the lights in their own collection. It's just a good habit to get into for organizing, and if you have too many lights or enough cameras and enough lights, you might just want to put cameras in their own collection and lights in their own collection, but I always combine them. Most of the time I combine them. Now the first thing that we're going to be creating is the water that the rose is sitting on. Very, very simple. Come over to the top, hit edit, click on preferences. We're going to need an add-on for this, but it's built in, so don't worry about it. Just search land in your little search bar for your add-ons. Click on this, and that should install it, or that should activate it. Now Shift A, go to mesh, and add a landscape. So be very careful when you're using a landscape or a landscape object, because if you click off of the object, you can't make any more edits. You have to delete the object and then add a new one. Here, I'll show you. So all right, if I'm making all these edits and then I accidentally click off of it, I cannot, as far as I know, you can't keep making edits to it. You can luckily delete it, Shift A, add a new one, and it will save those settings that you just had. Just know that essentially once you click off of it, it's kind of permanent unless you want to add a new object again. Okay, so we're actually just going to use a preset for this. So up at the top of this, we're gonna go down to Cauliflower Hills. I believe it was what I used. Now, if you're watching this and you've seen a million different ways that Blender artists make water and you're like, well, this isn't a great way. Yeah, I totally agree with you that there's, a lot of different ways you can make water in Blender, Musgrave, noise textures, stuff like that, even fluid sims. But this was just a look that I was just trying to put a unique kind of spin on it. I've never done it like this before, but I think it worked out pretty well for the scene that I was trying to make. I did change these subdivisions to 256. It does slow your system down the higher the subdivision, so keep that in mind as well. Come down here to the height, and we're gonna knock this down a bit, because those would be pretty ridiculous waves. I think a height of 0.15. No, that's still too high. I can't remember which one I did. Okay. Yeah, it looks like that's pretty good. We're gonna stick with that for now. and then whatever you want your waves to look like. You can play around with these settings to kind of change it, although this isn't really the point of the tutorial here. Like, I'm not trying to focus on this side of things, especially because this isn't typically the way you would make water in the first place, but feel free to experiment with those on your own. And you probably want to scale this up as well, so 10 seems about right. And then you want to position your camera to be somewhere in front of it like this. Make sure you put this water in its own collection, separate it from the camera and the lights. Don't forget to left click and then right click shade smooth. That's going to really make a difference when you're making water. And make sure that your camera settings are correct as well. So as you can see in my final result, I used a like Instagram friendly aspect ratio, which I believe was 1080 by 1350. Now that we have our water, let's go ahead and add in our rose. So you can head on over to sketchfab.com and search roses and just pick out a rose that you like. Read the terms of use and whatnot. A lot of them are just completely free to use. So I picked up a rose model off of Sketchfab myself, and I'm gonna import it. Okay, that's our rose. I believe it came imported with textures. Go to our material view. Yes, okay. For now, we're just gonna leave the rose in the center of that. I think it's better to just move your camera forward. Kind of center the rose somewhere around here on your camera. And pro tip, if you're having trouble with composition in your shots, a lot of people don't know this. It took me like a year of using Blender to find this, but if you're using the camera, head down to viewport display, and then composition guides. You can add all sorts of different like composition guides. Thirds, you know, you can find the center of your camera, really helpful. The golden ratio and everything. This is very helpful because it's better than just guessing. For the longest time, I would just guess. And once I found this, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. I can't believe I didn't know this was there. I'm gonna actually leave up the thirds one. So don't worry too much about the camera position right now, but just get it in a view that you can see the rose close enough. You're close enough to it, you can kind of see what's going on with it, and you're in a relatively good view with it, because it's always nice to be able to snap to your camera view to see from that perspective and kind of gauge what it's going to look like in a render. But we're just going to leave it at that. Now, here's where the geometry nodes come in. You're probably like, whoa, that looks nothing like the rose that you showed us at the beginning of the tutorial. Why is that? And you just downloaded this guy's rose, and now you're just using that. You said you're gonna teach us how to make it. You know, I get it, okay? So this rose is actually made of instance objects. What we did is we replaced this object and filled it in with a bunch of other objects. So it's really simple to do. Make sure you have your geometry node tab open down here. Click new. Title this rose. Here's where the fun begins. Okay, we're 18 minutes in, but here's where the fun begins. I wonder how this is gonna get edited. Okay, so the first node that we're gonna wanna add is Shift A, instance on points. Not 2 points, but instance on points. And then you can see that our geometry just completely disappears. You're like, what the hell? What happened? So that's why we have to bring in a Shift A, join geometry. Now this node is the node that you're probably going to use the most. Maybe not, but you're going to use it pretty much every time you use geometry nodes. And so now you can see if I plug this input into the join geometry nodes, now our rose is back. So basically we separated it, we're telling it to do something here, and then we're joining it back up with the original geometry. I'm gonna go ahead and just put this into the group output so we can see what's going on. Sorry if it's a bit confusing, but at this point you can actually just delete that join geometry node, because I was just showing you how to use it for the sake of demonstration, but you don't actually need it for this tutorial. So I should have deleted it after that. So as you can see, like I said, it's empty, and that's because we haven't given it anything to instance. And again, if you're familiar with particle systems, this is what you would do, is you would just tell it, you know, like fill this area with this object, and you click the object, you find the object. So that's essentially what we're doing here. So Shift A, object info. Now plug the geometry into the instance on this instance on points. Now this node is going to pull data from whatever piece of geometry, whatever object you select. Now in this scene right now, at the moment, I don't currently have anything to build the rows with. But as you can see in this scene, my actual scene, I used a bird that I modeled. I'm going to briefly explain how I did that, but I don't want to get too deep. I don't want to do this for too long. This is an interesting bird though, because I used a remesh modifier. So basically, whatever you want to make your rows out of, this is the step in the tutorial where you want to make that object right now, and then later we're going to use that object to build the rows. I'm going to demonstrate what I did real quick. So you're going to want to go to front view, then Shift A, then add in a reference image, click on that image that you want to model after, then Shift A, add in a plane, make sure that you still have that image selected, Shift S, cursor to selected, and then we're gonna go to Shift A and add in a plane. RX90, boom, we rotated it. Delete all but one of the vertices. So basically what you do, I'm not going to do it the whole way because it takes a while. It takes a lot of precision to really get it right. I'm just going to hit E and then G to kind of move it around and trace this object, like so on and so forth. Obviously you want to be probably a little more precise than I am right now, but you get the point. So eventually you would fill out that whole object. And then you would end up with something that looks kind of like this. This is a pretty low poly model, and that's very important. Whatever object that you're using to instance in this scenario, you're gonna wanna make sure it doesn't have a ton of geometry. It really adds up quick. We're basically talking about, you know, duplicating an object hundreds or thousands of times, so those vertices really add up. So keep it as low poly as you can. That's what I tried to do. I even use that to my advantage to kind of make it like look like it was intentional, like a creative decision to make, by adding a remesh modifier and switching it to, I believe when you first add a remesh, it's on voxel. Switch that to blocks. Make sure that remove disconnected is unchecked. And you can kind of see that I made this bird look like it's sort of a Minecraft bird. And it definitely does make it look less realistic, but given the context of this scene, the remesh modifier can make a lot of things look really, really cool. So definitely play around with that if you haven't before. Back on the geometry nodes, with this object info node selected, select your object. Mine is the bird, so probably gonna blow up at first. You know, be very careful with this. This is very intensive on your hardware. There's a few things going on here that are pretty bad, okay, and we're gonna fix those, so don't worry about it. I think for the sake of this tutorial, I might just use a different object because it really slows down viewport and it's just gonna make it really difficult to use for a tutorial. Let's remove that. It's just gonna slow it down way too much. So let's just use a different object altogether to build the rows. This is just for the sake of demonstration. Now, if you want the final output to look like it looked on my project, you're gonna want to make a bird similar to that and then use that here. We're gonna go over here and we're just gonna Shift A, add in a cylinder, say, scale that down. We're gonna make this rows out of cylinders. That's right. So it's gonna look like it's kind of made out of these coins almost. I think this is something I played around with actually while making a project. It actually looked pretty cool. I'm just gonna name this coins just so I know what it is. Select your rows again and let's search coins. Okay, now you can see it again is doing that, but there's less geometry, so it's not lagging as much, but it's still pretty intense, right? So the biggest thing right now is that the coins are just way too big. So obviously what we want to do is we want to change the scale of them. Now, that's actually pretty easy. So Shift A, and then go into random value, actually. What this is going to do is this node is going to assign a random value, as it says, to the scale. Based on your numbers up here, these will clamp it to a certain range. Plug this value into the scale. You can see it already made some changes. And we're gonna change this from float to vector. Now basically a vector, looks like it just unplugs when you do that. So you might have to change that first and then replug it back in. A vector number is basically a set of 3 numbers, whereas a float, I believe, is a decimal number. Is that correct? An integer is... Yes, a vector is a set of 3 numbers, so that's going to give you like a range of numbers to play with here on your x, y, and z, whereas if you go to float, it's just combining them all into one, so you're playing with x, y, and z on the same control, whereas the vector gives you control over all the different axes. So we're going to want like pretty small values, obviously. On the minimum, let's try 0.003. And then on the maximum, let's try 0.004. See, now we have a rose made out of these cylinders. Pretty cool, right? Now there's a ton of things you can do moving from this point forward, but let's say like I kind of wanted these to look more like coins, and it looks like they're too thick to be coins, right? So we actually want to mess around with the Z value right here to kind of flatten these coins a little bit and squish them down. Change it to like 0.001. And you can see that kind of plays with that size. And I could spend a lot of time kind of perfecting this, but you can see how these are all like a different size just based off, it's because it's randomized a little bit, and it's between 0.01 and 0.04. I'm gonna actually knock this Z down on the maximum too, because I don't want it to be that thick in any way. So now we squished them all down a little bit more, but there's some variation going on, and it's really cool because with particle systems, you couldn't really animate these values the same way that you can with geometry nodes, which is really what makes this powerful. Anything that you could do with particle systems was like, you might be able to do it, and you kind of have to do like, I don't know, tricky ways, and you have to like jerry rig everything. That's the way that I felt. Whereas this just makes a lot more sense once you get used to it. Okay, now you see that we want to play around with the rotation of these objects because we have them all in the same rotation, which I think looks fine in this scenario, but if you wanted to change it, definitely want to know how to do that. So just Shift D to duplicate this random value node, plug it into the rotation here. Now we should be getting a variety here, but they're using the same values as was in those other nodes. So just change this to 0 and change this to 1. Now you can see we have a whole range of different rotations going on here. Now, if we go into material view, you can see that our cylinders or our rose right now as it stands is just completely white. To change the color of this rose, the correct thing to do in this scenario, I would say, is just to change the color of this coin. You know, add a material to that coin using a shader editor. Let's just call this coins. And let's make it metallic like a coin would be. I might mess with that later, but you can see that it's pulling the data from that coin and using it as the material. So to make this a rose-like color, and I have a hex code actually that I put in, it's B5474A. And the whole point of this scene was trying to invoke like a feeling of calmness. It's supposed to be really soothing on the eyes. So a lot of times what helps with that is having like a relatively low reflective surface. So I get it that coins are, if we were doing coins, they would be metallic and pretty reflective, but we are not doing that in this scenario. We're gonna turn this specular down to something like around there. Your roughness at around 0.7. It just gives this really like smooth and calming sort of look to it. Okay, we're not done with the rose, but for now I think that's good enough. We're gonna add some details later, but I want to, first of all, why is this still here? So unorganized. Let's add in the rain that you can see, which is again using geometry nodes. So Shift A and add in an icosphere. See, it's over here right now. Change the subdivisions to 3 or 4. Shift S, cursor to world origin. Make sure that this object is at the, you want this to be surrounding your scene as if it's like a circle. That's what I was doing, you know. We're gonna make this sphere, we're gonna fill it with its own geometry node. So make sure you open your geometry nodes, click new, title this raindrops. Let's come over here and let's add in Shift A icosphere. Subdivisions at about 3. Again, you want to keep the poly count relatively low, so that's why I'm not using a UV sphere in this instance. Now tab into edit mode. Let's click 1 to get into front view. Make sure that you click O or come up here and turn on proportional editing. Switch this into transparent view mode. So grab this top vertice up here and then press G and move it upwards. So GZ. And you can kind of see how this is looking like a raindrop a little bit. So we're gonna leave it at about right there. If this isn't a perfect raindrop, don't worry. For this tutorial, I think it'll do well. So Shift A, shade smooth. I do think that vertice is a little too pointy, that is. So let's title this Raindrop. And now go back to your icosphere, your giant one over here. Let's center in the camera view and let's go Shift A, instances, instance on point, and then Shift A, add in an object info node. Make sure that the object that is selected are your raindrops. Plug this geometry into the instance. So again, by default, rarely are these scale values and rotation values actually like appropriate for what you want to make of the scene. You might want to scale your raindrops down a ton and then click Control A and apply scale, and you can see that that really made a difference. So you can do that until you get like within a range where you think that you can tweak it enough on geometry nodes without like using a ridiculously small number. Like you could see we were using 0.003 earlier for the coins, and that's pretty small. After a while it doesn't even display past that, so this is a way that you can kind of change that. So now you can see that we have an environment which has a bunch of raindrops around it. You can definitely make something of this already. I mean, there's a ton of ideas that pop into mind. It just looks like a cool kind of background, right? But again, they're all the same. It used to be in particle systems that in order to like create variation of an object that you're instancing, it was hard to do kind of using the settings within the particle systems without just like adding a collection of varying objects, which you can do that sort of thing with geometry nodes. But just with this one object, we can create a ton of different raindrops, which we'll do for this. It's very similar to the rose geometry nodes. We're gonna Shift A, add in a random value, change this to vector, plug this into the scale. Now you can see like, okay, well, you definitely don't want a raindrop that looks like this one right here. That's just ridiculous. These ones look pretty cool. This probably looks the most realistic of them. You know, some of these are just way too thick. I think this one's like super flat. Can't tell from this angle. But anyways, we're getting a lot of different variations, and a lot of them don't necessarily look right. And that's why it's very good to understand how these minimum and maximum values work. We don't really want to crush any of these values on the scale. We don't really want to crush any of them to 0. So if we change it to something like 0.1, you can see how that started to make changes. I think what I used officially was 0.3. Kind of got rid of all those really stupid looking ones. So basically what that did is, I mean, it's kind of explanatory, like self-explanatory, you know, but it's not going any lower than 0.3 of the scale of that object. And then it's not going any higher than 1 at the original scale of that object. So it's not surpassing it and going way bigger. It's clamped between 0.3 and 1. Some really weird looking ones still, like we have this one which kind of looks like, I don't know, like a Hershey's chocolate more than anything. That's why we are on vector, so that we can play with the individual axes. So on your max, try to squish these raindrops a little bit more and kind of make them look like a little bit more elongated, right? Because you notice in like real pictures, raindrops more than anything really just look like streaks, like just a streak of water more than anything. That's why these ones right here are kind of more realistic than the rest of these, but they're not necessarily. We're making more of like drops, like water dripping from a table, more than like actual raindrops here. So keep that in mind if you're trying to make real raindrops. On the X value of this max, we're gonna want to take this down so that it can't go past a certain point. You can see that already made a difference and kind of squished them down a bit. also squish the Y values, and it's looking like that's pretty close to what we want. Now, if you want to stretch these out to kind of like get rid of the cartoony looking shape of them, do that by playing with the Z value. But I think for this tutorial, I think this is fine. This looks good. Okay, so now we have all these raindrops, but the rotation is all the same. That isn't really what we want. I'm gonna hit H to shrink that down and hide it. We're gonna add in a Shift A random value again. You can see how some of these nodes are gonna get used a lot, right? Change this again to vector, plug this into the rotation, and again, we get really crazy, just ridiculous values going on here. Now let's try clamping these maximum values to something like 0.3. Maybe like 0.25 is better. 0.25. Kind of straightening them out a little bit, but they still do have rotation. And then on this X value, change this to 0.1. So let's change this Y minimum value to something like negative 0.1 or negative 0.2. I'm actually just going to keep doing that until I get a result that I kind of like. All right, now let's play with the scale of this sphere, because we want to be able to see some of these nodes. And because of the way that I designed this, we're not like filling the volume of the sphere with raindrops. It's just the outside faces of it. Okay, we're gonna bring this camera a little bit closer to the rows now, and we're gonna scale this down even more, the icosphere. And we're gonna, until we find something that we like, we're just gonna keep rotating this. So this is something that I like, kind of, but you can see that this raindrop, again, kind of looks like a candy corn more than anything. So we can play with the seed here and kind of change and randomize them. And you can see how it's been completely changed into be looking like something else, but it's kept the same position. So now if we switch to render view, or let's switch to material view, this is what we're looking at. So we're gonna wanna add a shader to these raindrops. So what I did for this material is just a simple kind of water shader. I tinted the color blue just a little bit. Here's the hex value if you want it. And then turn the specular all the way up, roughness all the way down. And then if you really want like a realistic looking raindrop, turn your transmission all the way up, and then you can kind of play around with these alpha values. Simple, really simple shader. Once we added this material, now we have raindrops that have that material. So now with the bottom floor, which is the water selected, let's go ahead and add that shader to it as well. Now, click on the water, the ground right here, the ground water, and then click on this little icon that says 3. That just means that this material has been used 3 times on different objects in this scene. So click on that, and we're gonna wanna name this one water. So this has separated the water material of the ground from the water material that we're using on the rain. And so now if you mess around with the water on the ground, you can see it doesn't affect the rain up here, whereas before they were linked, and so they would edit together. Now that we're edging closer to the end of our scene, now we're gonna want to start using a render view to kind of get the lighting correct and prepare this for an actual render. So let's go Shift A, add in a plane, RX90, and then scale this up. This is gonna be the background of this scene. And change this background plane to a new material, call it like background. Let's change it, the color, to something sort of reddish pink, kind of in that color range. Now we're gonna add in a world, so switch this from object to world, and Shift A, add in a sky texture. So I just ran into something I didn't really even know was a thing, but if you add it in this sky texture, I forgot to tell us to switch to cycles, and if you added in this Nishita sky texture, it's not going to work in Eevee, so switch to cycles. And now you can see our result is already looking a lot better. I mean, I just love cycles so much. I know there's a lot of fans of Eevee, but I personally think that cycles is like way better, no competition. Sorry, bro. Switch your render device from CPU to GPU if you can. Make sure that you're using optics by going over to edit and preferences, go to System and Optics over here. You can check both your GPU and your CPU and render with both of them. For the viewport, max samples, probably cut this down to like 100 max. Honestly, it used to be default of like 30. So I'm just gonna cut it down to 40. 1,000 by default seems pretty high to me. I don't know why they do that. And then also this render value here, we'll get more into this, but this is also high. Let's just knock this down to 100 for now. Those are not the final though. So with this sky texture selected, you can see that we have this like kind of neat looking sky here. If you wanted, you can add an HDRI, but I think for this scene, this sky texture works fine. I'm gonna copy the values that I used in my original scene, which was 1 for the air, dust around 0.79, and then I changed the ozone to like 0.5. And everything else was kept relatively the same. And now you can see that with this sky texture, we're getting a lot more cool reflections. And you can obviously add more realistic reflections using an HDRI, but this is really cool as well. So you can see the difference. Let's just change this to something that's white. You can see if we were just using a white background, this is what it would look like, right? But if we add in a sky texture, we get a lot more reflections going on here, kind of like a rainbow look going on with that water, which looks really cool. Now, since we're using the render mode and we're going to be playing around with lighting a ton, it's probably a good time to tell you, I probably should have told you earlier, but I think I didn't mention it. If your geometry nodes are really slowing down the viewport, then you can just disable them and it'll just display the original object. So you would go on your modifier tab of that object of the rows, so select the rows, go into your modifiers and disable that. But it's not a problem for me, it's not really slowing me down. But when I had the birds, that's how I had to do it. I go to render properties, change the exposure to 0.3. That kind of brightens the scene up a little bit more. And now we're gonna start adding lights. So make sure that you're selecting your camera and lights collection. So starting off, we're gonna try to use a 3-point lighting setup, and then we're gonna go based off of that and kind of edit things from there. But we're gonna use that as a base and then build on top of it. So if you're not familiar with 3-point lighting, basically what it is you have a key light, which is like your main light, and then you have a rim light, which is like illuminating the outlines of an object, whereas a key light is usually in the front, kind of towards the left or the right. Then you have a fill light, which softens the shadows that the key light is casting. So you'll get really harsh shadows using the key light most of the time, and so that's why we use fill lights to kind of soften them up but not completely get rid of them. When I'm lighting a scene, and when you're lighting a scene, you want to make sure that it conveys the story to the viewer, to the audience, and it doesn't stray completely off path. Like if I used a totally wrong lighting setup for this, then because this whole thing is supposed to be calm and soothing, if I made like a bunch of red lights and made the scene really dark, it would defeat the whole purpose. That would be like more of a horror scene. So you want to make sure that it follows the story that you're trying to convey, and then also you want to make sure that it illuminates enough of the scene to show detail, to give geometry, and explain to the viewer what's going on. Let's go Shift S cursor to world origin, and let's add in our first light, which is going to be our key light. Title this key. Set the value somewhere around 30. Open a new window over here so we're going to move the light in this window, which is going to be in solid view, and we're going to hide this these raindrops. Click on them, hit H. So but we're going to move it over here in this tab, and then we're going to see how it's changing everything in the render view. We're going to want to put this key light sort of in front of the object but to the side. So G, Y, G, X. I'm going to move it to the side here. R, X. A rotation of, I don't know, 77 degrees it looks like. To start with might be good. Rotate on Z. Let's go ahead and disable our world so we can see what each of these lights is doing. You can disable your world by unchecking use nodes, and then make sure that the color over here is all the way black, and that's just not going to add any light to your scene using a world. So the only light right now is our key light. This is what our key light looks like. You can see it's kind of adding some shadows here. Mess around till you get something you like, kind of makes more geometry. But as I was talking about, you can see how like this shadow in this corner right here is very, very dark, and in certain scenarios you would keep it that way. But for this scenario, we're gonna wanna soften that shadow. So Shift A, add in a point light. This fill light, title it fill. Move this as well over to the side, and we're softening the shadows here. So we're gonna keep that there for now, and then we're gonna Shift A, add in a area light, RX -90, I believe. Yes, okay. We're gonna place this on the back. I'll show you here. I just maximized the window by hitting Control Space. So we're gonna put this on the back behind the rows, and this is how we illuminate the edges of the rows. Now Control Space will minimize that window again. Change this from a square to a ellipse, I believe is what I did. Kind of bring this up a little bit more. You can see how this already adds some neat reflections on the water as well. But this is all it looks like on its own when we disable those other lights. So what we want to do with the rim light is to kind of bring out the edges of your object. And so usually the rim light, from what I know, is the most powerful light in the scene. So our key light was at 30 and our fill is at 10. Let's put our rim light for now at like 50 and see what that does. Okay, and you might want to bring it back a little bit, just a little bit more on the Y. Okay, that's what it looks like for now. Because of the nature of our object, this isn't necessarily a great demonstration because the coins are kind of making it shine through. But if we disabled that in a modifier, you can see if we disable the geometry nodes, that what this rim light is doing now. Let's make sure to title that rim. So this is what our rim light is doing, and this is what our key light is doing, and this is what our fill light is doing. So there's a ton of different ways you could light this scene, but we're going for a certain vibe, which is to be serene. Okay, so calm and undisturbed. That's the feeling, the story that you're trying to invoke, the emotions you're trying to invoke in your viewers. So you want to make sure that you stick by that. So as it stands, let's check this world again, and this is currently what we have. You can see it's probably way too bright. So let's turn the background down to something like 0.2. And now let's kind of correct some of these things. So I didn't nail the background, so we're gonna want to change the roughness on that to something around 0.85. The rest of that seems to be good. You can see though, once we add our raindrops back in, that we're getting very close to being done with this. So we basically just need more lights. Let's set the world to like 0.4 or something like that. Let's start tweaking these values a little bit more on these lights. So let's actually we want to make sure that these shadows are really soft, and we don't want harsh lights, especially casting from just from the scene overall. We don't want harsh shadows, but to make the fill lights especially, we don't want to be harsh. So to change that, we want to change the size of this lamp. Probably double this to 0.5 would be nice, and change it to 20 watts. And then move it a little bit on the X or on the Y and the X. I'm gonna knock that back down to like 15. So you can see we still have shadows, right? We still have some shadows here, but they're not too harsh. So I actually want to place this key lamp just a little bit more off to the side, actually. So I'm going to hit G and I'm going to hit Shift Z. And that'll basically make sure that it locks it on the X and the Y and won't move it on the Z axis. G, Shift Z. Make sure that we cast enough shadows. And you can see we are. Now the final thing that I did here, which is kind of cheating, I think, because we're using a sky texture, and then I don't think you're supposed to use a sun and a sky texture at the same time necessarily, but I did just because why not? So Shift A, add in a sun. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to make these shadows over here pop out, but I also want to illuminate the rest of the scene. We want to make it so that the sun is basically casting down from this direction and hitting our flower from the left side, casting shadows onto the right side. So rotate it on the Y, 45 degrees or something like that. Let's disable all these other lights to see what the sun is doing. Change the strength to 30. You might be able to do without the key light, actually. Let's see. You can see how experimental this stuff can be, right? But I'm gonna keep the key light. But the sunlight over here is really what makes this scene look awesome. So that's kind of the final touch with that. Turn on that rim light, we get this nice reflection coming from the back here. And that fill light kind of soften those shadows. Okay, now let's play with the colors of these lights just a little bit. We don't want to be too intense, but we do want to play around with it a little bit. So let's make this rim light kind of tint it blue, just slightly. We don't want to make it too saturated, but tint it blue just a little bit. Because what I want to do is, in these shadows of the water, basically, I want to add blue, just a blue tint. So that's how we're going to do this, by changing the color of the lights. We're going to use the same color on this fill light, or on this rim light. We're just going to copy this hex code, paste it into the fill light. And then on the key light, we're going to change this to be a little bit the same. Like, yeah, exactly the same. And that's kind of added just a little bit of blue tint to the scene. Now you can play around with this a little bit more, depending on how blue you want it to be. I'm going to add it just a little bit more saturation, maybe like 0.3. And then, let's see. I think that's more of what I was going for. So copy that. Once you get the value that you want, the color that you want, just copy that and paste that into all the hex codes of your lights. So keep your sun to be basically white. If you want, you can maybe tint it just a little bit to be a little bit warmer, so kind of in that orange area. And that, I think, looks really cool. Now, we are lacking some light on this background over here. It looks very plain, very boring to me. So to change that, put that sun value to like 60. It kind of gives this like a cartoon look that I really enjoy. I really like it. All right, so let's change the color of this background, because I think I got it wrong. So I just copied this hex code and pasted it in from my other scene. This is FF9090. That's pretty easy to remember, FF9090. Kind of lightened up the scene a little bit. Now on to rendering it. There's definitely some tweaks that we could make here and there, but I think this is looking pretty good. Let's go into your view layer properties, and under passes, select mist. In your view layer properties, after you check mist, head over to world and then go to mist pass. And then at the top of your viewport here, let's change the render pass to mist. And this is going to show you what that mist output is going to output. We're trying to add depth to the scene. So anything that's completely black, the darker something is, the less mist there is. So let's make sure this mist starts like, I don't know, very close to the beginning. Let's put it at like 1. And then change the depth of this. We want to have a gradient, right? Because if we have just solid black, then everything is going to look like there's no mist at all. And if we have solid white, it's just going to be completely white. You can see this gradient going on here, which is kind of displaying to us what it's going to look like when we add this over. So that's probably good for now. It's got a gradient throughout the entire scene, and I think we can make use of this. This is going to add like some volume like mist to the scene without being an actual volume shader and taking a ton of time to render. Let's go to your output properties and make sure this is on PNG. Change this to 16 RGB. We don't need RGBA. RGBA basically, that's RGB, red, green, blue, alpha. We don't need the alpha channel. The alpha channel is for transparency, and we're not trying to make the final output of this file have any transparent qualities. If you wanted to make this like a higher resolution, which is what I usually do here, is I just, change this from 100 to 200%. But for the sake of this, because I don't need to make it super high res, I'm just going to keep it at 100%. Let's go over to your render properties, and make sure that denoise is selected, but switch it from open image to optics. Open image uses a different denoising pattern, and it can kind of give it a weird look. It's a cool look. It looks creative in a lot of ways. I actually do like it, but I do think that most of the time, especially if you're going for a more realistic kind of look, optics is definitely better for that. And then for samples, let's put the max samples at 1000. Yeah, so 1000 using Cycles X, it should pump out pretty fast, especially when we go down here. Mess with these light paths, these bounces over here. So we don't need a ton of bounces, so I'm gonna change the max total to 8, but I'm gonna up the diffuse and the glossy to 8. You don't necessarily have to change your transmission from 12 to 8. If you already put this at 8, it's just gonna clamp it at 8, but just for the sake of this, I clamped it. I just put this down at 8. And yeah, make sure that your transmission and transparent bounces are set at the top as well, because if you don't have transparency or transmission bounces, the water in this scene is very important. So it's not going to look good at all because there's transmission and transparency going on there. This is going to do good enough for now. When we're done and we finalize the compositing of this image, we can up the resolution and we can up the samples a little bit if necessary to get a final render that looks really, really good. But for now, because we want to keep everything moving quick and fast, don't put your samples too high and don't put your resolution too high. So you can hit F12 to render, or you can just come up here and click render. All right, so let's switch to compositing over here and click use nodes. So if you're familiar with Blender compositing, it also uses nodes like the rest of Blender pretty much. I would say you can do most things using Blender compositing that you can do in Photoshop, but they're kind of like jerry-rigged in some ways, where it's like, I don't know why you have to do that many steps to get there. But we're not doing anything too complex here, so luckily this is very simple. So you can see here, because we checked in our view layer properties, because we checked mist, we have a mist output here. So click on your, can't remember what, this is probably called the render input. So click on this, Control Shift and click, and that'll add a viewer node. Plug that into the viewer node. Click V and you can change the scale of the viewer. So V to scale it down, Alt V to scale it up. And then let's go Shift A and add in a mix node. And plug this in to here. Okay, so Shift D to duplicate this mix node and plug this into the bottom socket of this mix node. Now let's take this mist input or mist output and let's plug it into the top value of this mix node. So make sure that you change this RGB, this mix node, to color, and this is going to change the color of our mist. And so I want to give this just a little bit of like a pinkish, pink or red sort of tint to it. So probably something like that. Kind of fit the color palette of our scene, right? Now we need to overlay it onto our render. So that's what this mix node is going to do. So let's Control Shift click on that, and so now that'll be the one that's plugged in. Now we use the factor to control how much of this mist you want into the scene. We actually want to change this to something like add or screen are very similar. I don't want to explain that today, but you can use add or you can use screen. I used add in this. It really does add a little bit of a pop to this. Watch this right here as I play with the factor. It gives this more of like an immersive environment, right? Now that I'm looking at this, I noticed that I forgot another thing to show you. But this is exactly why I didn't put the sample count too high, and it's why I didn't put it at 100% or 200% resolution or something ridiculous. And this is something like, this is a message to beginners. Your first render is almost never going to be your final renders. And if it is, it's probably not going to be good. Don't try to force it. Like, don't try to force your first render to be your final render. Be prepared to make some changes after your first render. So the one thing that I forgot to do, we're going to go back into the viewport over here, change this back to combined. And I'm actually going to go in material mode because it's easier to see this. Select our camera, and we need to add a depth of field. This was actually very important to the scene because it kind of blurs the raindrops that are too close or very close to us. and makes the rows the focus of the scene. So check depth of field, use your eyedropper to select the rows. Let's change the f-stop to something like 4. This value depends on what you want to do, but the more you turn it down, the more blurry things are. The more you turn it up, the less blurry it gets. So, and now the reason I switched to material view instead of render view is because if you are trying to do this in render view, you can kind of see what's happening, but especially if you have a lot within the scene, it's hard to see when you're scrolling the f-stop what's really going on because of all the grain and everything. So that's why I like to use material preview for that. And one other thing I wanted to do is kind of place this rose on the surface of the water, more like that, and move this camera down just a little bit because we want to center that rose. Now let's render this out again. Okay, very nice. I really do love that depth of field. I think it's important to add. And then we're gonna do 2 last things here. This is just to achieve the scene that I made. So it's not like you do this on every project or anything, but Shift A, add in a hue saturation value node. Sorry, hue saturation value. Make sure that the final node of your node tree here is plugged into composition, or the composition, or the composite. Sorry, make sure it's plugged into the composite hue saturation, because I think that the way that this color palette works, the hue is very similar, the colors are very close on a color wheel. We're basically just using a variation of the color red or reddish orange, and we're kind of staying in that wheelhouse. So when we play with this hue, you can see it can look cool with purple, it can look like cool with pink and orange right there. And so that's how I achieve these different results on my end. I really like that purple one too. But yeah, as you can see over here, what I did right here is kind of played around with those, messed around with the hues. Looks really nice, right? So here's the orange one, pink one, yellow. I think this is like more of the reddish one, pink. You can play around with that, make it look really cool. And then Shift A, add in a brightness contrast. Sure, that's plugged in to here as well. And then up the contrast to something like 1, maybe 2. See, if we don't want to go too high on the contrast here, because although it looks kind of cool, it does make the scene more harsh, and it's less easy on the eyes. It's not as soft, and it doesn't invoke that sort of like calm, serene sort of feeling, which again, abiding by the story that I wrote for this scene, was something that I wanted to make sure that people felt when they saw this. So always keep that in mind when you're color correcting, color grading. It's very important because there's a million different ways you can color grade a scene, but if it doesn't convey the story, then it doesn't work. It doesn't really fit. Like, I could make this look cool in 10 different ways that make you feel 10 different ways. And so that's why it's really important, and I'll probably make videos on this in the future, but it's really important for all your personal projects. Type up a quick project brief, lay out like what's the story of your scene, do a little bit of a world build, and then what are the feelings you want people to feel when they see this. That really helps guide you throughout all of your creative decisions that you make, so that you're not just trying to make something that looks good but also feels a certain way. It feels good or feels appropriate with all the decisions that you make. That's just kind of my final pro tip of today. Some of the final color grading and color correction stuff I did in Lightroom. That's just part of my workflow, but I wanted to show you guys how you could do almost all of this within Blender. You can do a lot of color grading in Blender, so don't worry about it. Don't think like, oh, he's using Lightroom, I can't use that, I can't get this result. You can get very close, if not the same result, if you spend enough time using Blender to play with these color values of this scene. And then one last thing I want to say is make sure that when you're using your final render, that your sample count is high enough and your resolution is high enough. But it looks like we're pretty good. I thought at first that this was grain, but it looks like it's just holes. Reflections of the little gaps that we have from our coins here. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you learned a lot. It actually took a lot longer to film than I suspected it would. But I wanted to make sure that I covered everything in detail, and that if you are familiar with Blender but not too familiar, close to a beginner, that you could follow this along. So if you are an intermediate user or an advanced user, I apologize for it being so long, but I always want to keep the beginner viewers in mind as well, because that's kind of the point of this tutorial with the geometry nodes, is just showing you that, it doesn't have to be super complex. I know that there's been a lot of renders being shown off recently of people making like entire forests and cities and stuff using only geometry nodes. It's kind of overwhelming, especially if you're a beginner. I could only imagine, right? But you can make some really cool things just using the simple parts of geometry nodes, and use that knowledge and kind of build on top of it as you go. Don't try to learn all of it at once, but as you sort of get around and start to understand everything, experiment with it, build on top of it. I can't wait to start animating with geometry nodes. I think that's something I'm going to play around with this scene as well. I'm Jordan Needham. This has been Jham 3D. I hope you guys enjoyed and learned a lot from this tutorial, and I will catch you guys next time.